The night in Ouagadougou felt heavier than smoke. Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of his armored SUV, dust from the northern front still clinging to his boots. Under the amber streetlights, victory looked nothing like celebration. It looked like exhaustion carved into the eyes of a soldier who had seen too much. But inside his quiet home, something waited. A silence thicker than the battlefield. A letter trembling in the hands of the only woman he trusted. You're about to witness a story that many headlines will never tell. It isn't just about corruption or justice. It's about what happens when a leader decides that silence is no longer protection. In the next few minutes, you'll see why this night inside Ibrahim Traoré's home became the spark for something much larger than politics. You will understand how a single act of deceit can ripple through the foundations of Burkina Faso and reveal the unseen cost of loyalty. And this isn't a story for those who listen casually. It's for those who still believe that truth, when spoken at the right moment, can change the direction of a nation. If you turn away now, you will miss what really drives men like Ibrahim Traoré. Not power, not pride, but the unbearable weight of those they swore to protect. You'll miss the reason why this moment, this single night, might redefine what it means to lead with conscience. Because once the truth breaks the surface, it never goes back to sleep. The first revelation was quiet. No gunfire, no alarm, just the sound of a man reading numbers that didn't make sense. The balance on Auntie Miriam's account was zero, 30 years of savings, gone in a line of digits. For Ibrahim Traoré, it wasn't the loss that froze his breath, it was the language of the letter, liquidity restructuring, indefinite freeze, market correction, words that pretended to be law, but in truth were weapons dressed as paper. That single sheet of paper revealed more than theft. It revealed a system feeding on its own people. And behind those polished phrases hid the fingerprints of men who wore medals on their uniforms. One document, one name, one number, each enough to open a wound across Burkina Faso's fragile heart. The trail began months earlier, when polished men in imported suits visited the neighborhoods of the elderly. They called it a patriot fund. They used national slogans, flags, and promises of secured pensions. They came with stamped envelopes, fake guarantees, and cameras that captured smiles of trust. Then they vanished with the money of widows and soldiers' mothers. It spread like smoke, first in the capital, then the provinces. Rumors whispered of state-backed investments that never existed. When banks denied responsibility, shame sealed the victims' mouths. They stopped speaking, stopped asking, stopped believing. For Ibrahim Traoré, this wasn't random fraud, it was a mirror reflecting something far deeper. Betrayal from within. Someone in power had to approve the documents. Someone with access to classified pension lists. The numbers didn't just vanish, they were rerouted, repurposed, and justified through bureaucratic deceit. And the first to bleed were the people who believed most, the poor, the loyal, the forgotten. That night, the captain didn't see corruption. He saw war, one waged not with rifles, but with signatures. And he knew this was only the first shot. Every story needs a guide, a face that reminds us what truth looks like when power begins to rot. In this one, that face is Ibrahim Traoré himself, but not the commander from the news or the man behind podiums. This is the soldier who still knocks on doors alone, who listens before he speaks, who carries a nation's bruises in his silence. That night, he became his own witness. When Auntie Miriam trembled, he didn't ask for explanations. He asked one question: who did this? Her silence was the answer he feared most. And when he unfolded that fraudulent letter, he understood. It wasn't just her they had stolen from. It was every forgotten mother who'd buried a son under the flag. The next morning, Ibrahim Traoré didn't summon ministers or call a meeting. He drove himself into the city, past the checkpoints that saluted him without knowing where he was going. At an office tower dressed in glass and deceit, he found the name on the letterhead, Apex Legacy Trust. Inside, laughter spilled from rooms full of coffee and counterfeit success. He walked straight through, no guards, no hesitation, and laid the crumpled paper on the manager's desk. The room went silent. The man behind the desk smiled too easily. He thought the president was bluffing. He wasn't, because from that moment, the game changed. The story of a stolen pension became a war between those who fed on the system and the one man willing to burn it down if it meant giving his people back their dignity. It started with a sound, the sharp crack of a door kicked open. Inside the glass-walled office of Apex Legacy Trust, papers fluttered through the air like frightened birds. Ibrahim Traoré stood in the doorway, the crumpled letter in his hand. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the manager, a man wrapped in perfume and arrogance, rose from his chair and shouted about trespassing. Traoré said nothing. He simply placed the letter on the desk and asked for the money. One sentence, 8 words, a command, not a plea. The manager sneered. "Read the fine print," he said. "It's legal." His fingers twitched toward the phone. "You can't touch us. You have no idea who owns this building." Then he dialed a number that would break more than glass. A familiar voice answered, deep, authoritative, angry. It was General Kolo, a man who had sat beside Ibrahim in council meetings, who once toasted to loyalty and the Republic. Now that same voice barked threats through the speaker. "Who are you? Do you know who you're dealing with?" Ibrahim leaned forward and said 5 quiet words. "This is Captain Traoré speaking." Silence, thick, suffocating silence. Then a nervous stutter. "Mr. President, I can explain." But it was too late for explanations. Ibrahim ended the call. The manager's grin faded. The gold watch on his wrist caught the light like a shekel. Traoré folded the letter, slid it into his pocket, and said softly, "Don't leave the city." He left the office without a single guard. Behind him, panic spread like a stain. By the time he reached his car, he knew the line between justice and vengeance had already blurred. That night marked the first aftershock. He met with his intelligence officer, so in a small unmarked building outside Ouagadougou, the laptop and files taken from the manager's desk were spread across a metal table. The data revealed names, transactions, offshore accounts, each link tying the scam to high-ranking officials. When the final file opened, So's hands trembled. The victims weren't random. They were the families of fallen soldiers, the widows of men who died defending the nation. Their death benefits were being stolen the moment they were released. Traoré's jaw tightened. "That's not corruption," he said. "That's desecration." He ordered arrest before dawn, but the predators were faster. Before his men could move, his phone rang, a distorted voice warning him to return what he had taken. They had found Miriam within minutes. He was back in his SUV, driving through red lights and chaos. The city blurred into streaks of fear and headlights. At his home, 2 men stood by the gate, one reaching into his jacket. Ibrahim didn't hesitate. The crash echoed across the neighborhood. Metal bent. Glass shattered, and in that explosion of noise, the war truly began. Numbers rarely lie, but the people behind them often do. When Ibrahim Traoré's intelligence team began tracing the stolen funds, what emerged wasn't just a pattern, it was a network. The baseline, over $3.2 million, vanished within 90 days, disguised as pension reinvestments. The delta, only 4 bank accounts held all the money, each tied to offshore firms registered in the Cayman Islands. It wasn't financial collapse, it was engineering. The more they looked, the clearer the equation became. Every seminar for the elderly had the same printouts, the same QR code, the same forged signature. The company wasn't a company at all. It was a laundering mechanism designed inside the walls of government, so ran algorithms to match names. And the results hit like artillery. 117 victims, mostly widows of soldiers killed between 2019 and 2025. Each name carried a story. One woman sold her sewing machine to invest, believing it was the president's initiative. Another borrowed from her neighbors to buy medicine after her savings vanished. Each number on the spreadsheet wasn't a statistic, it was a wound. Then came the second layer, the velocity of betrayal. Within 48 hours of every transfer, the accounts were drained and closed. The funds moved through multiple shell corporations, bounced across 3 continents, and finally converged under a trust owned by the wife of the Minister of Defense, the same minister who gave public speeches about modernizing the army. The numbers screamed their own truth. Scale, speed, and precision. Proof that this wasn't greed by chance. It was policy by design. Traoré stared at the figures projected on the wall, the digits blurred, transforming into faces, the families of the dead, the weary eyes of Auntie Miriam, the broken trust of a nation. Behind every transfer was a betrayal signed with official ink. "This isn't corruption anymore," he said quietly. "This is treason." For once, so didn't speak. The air in the room thickened, heavy with something beyond anger, purpose. The soldiers outside didn't know what had been uncovered inside, but they could feel it. A storm was building, one made not of gunfire but of proof. By dawn, the reports were ready. The evidence was bulletproof, time-stamped, encrypted, but before it could be sent to the national prosecutor, the power went out. Then came the sound of tires screeching outside, engines, boots, and radio silence. The enemy wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the corridors of the power, armed with warrants, rumors, and lies. 3 numbers remained on the screen before the lights died completely. 117 victims, 4 accounts, 1 command. It was enough to destroy reputations or regimes. When the generator kicked back on, Ibrahim Traoré didn't look at the data again. He looked at his sidearm. For a man like him, numbers weren't just proof. They were orders. Every revolution, even one born from truth, faces its critics. Some said Ibrahim Traoré had gone too far, that no president should take justice into his own hands. Others whispered that his pursuit of corruption was merely a purge wrapped in morality. He listened. He always listened, because in a country haunted by coups and broken promises, suspicion was a second language. The first argument came from the so-called pragmatists. They said stability mattered more than purity, that exposing high-ranking officers during a fragile recovery could destabilize the entire state. It was better, they claimed, to clean quietly, to sacrifice a few truths for the illusion of peace. Traoré didn't reject that logic outright. He understood it too well. But peace built on silence, he said, was just another kind of war, one fought against memory itself, facts ignored where wounds left to rot. The second argument came from the loyalists of the old guard. They accused him of betraying the brotherhood, of humiliating generals who once fought beside him. "You cannot rebuild an army by shaming its spine," one retired colonel warned on radio. But the data didn't care for rank or nostalgia. The files proved what oaths could not erase. Some of those same generals had sold their soldiers' blood for a pension scheme. Ibrahim Traoré's response was not fury, but restraint. "We do not destroy our past," he said. "We confront it, so it stops destroying us." That single sentence became a fracture line across Burkina Faso. Half the nation saw courage, the other half saw defiance. Yet beneath the debate, something deeper stirred. For the first time in years, citizens felt the truth was no longer forbidden speech. Even those who doubted him admitted one thing: no one else had ever dared open that door. And in that uneasy balance between faith and fear, the country began to breathe again, and then everything turned. It began with a message, 8 words flashing on a secure line: "They have her. They want the laptop back." In that instant, the investigation stopped being political. It became personal. Ibrahim Traoré wasn't chasing thieves anymore. He was racing against a clock measured in heartbeats. Auntie Miriam's name had been spoken by people who should never have known she existed. They had found his only weakness, and they were using it to pull him into the open. When he heard the word God and whispered through the static, he didn't hesitate. He left the safe house, left his team, left the files. But what waited at his home wasn't fear. It was bait. The black sedan, the suited men, the false calm. That was the moment the line between leader and soldier vanished. From here, the story wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about loyalty, revenge, and the unbearable price of both. What Ibrahim Traoré was about to face would not only decide his fate, it would expose the shadow war that had been watching him all along. The explosion of that night didn't just shake a neighborhood, it rippled through the country like a pulse. Within hours, state media called it an isolated incident. But the truth had already leaked from phones, from witnesses, from the smell of the burnt tires on the president's street. The consequences came fast and merciless. For the state, the impact was immediate. Ministries scrambled to deny involvement, while generals met behind locked doors. The arrest warrants that Ibrahim Traoré signed before the attack were quietly revoked. A press statement declared an internal misunderstanding. Yet everyone knew what it meant. Someone powerful was rewriting the narrative in real time. The trust between command and government, once fragile, now fractured completely. The military's unity, Burkina Faso's last shield, was bleeding from within. For the business sector, panic took a different form. The banks implicated in the Apex legacy trust scandal froze their digital portals for maintenance. Investors fled the capital. In 48 hours, over $12 million of private capital disappeared overseas. Local entrepreneurs, those few who still believed in rebuilding after sanctions, found themselves cornered again. The economy didn't collapse, it simply stopped breathing. For the people, the pain was quieter, crueler. Supermarkets raised prices overnight, pharmacies refused credit. Families who once saluted the national flag now whispered questions they'd never dared to ask: who are we fighting for? Mothers of soldiers wept not just for their sons but for their stolen dignity. In the villages, the story of Auntie Miriam spread like folklore. An old woman robbed by her own protectors, saved by a man who refused to forget her name. For the region, the tremors crossed borders. Neighbors in the Sahel watched closely. Some saw opportunity, others saw warning. Leaders who once mocked Traoré's defiance of foreign influence now feared his endurance. If a young captain could expose his own corrupt elite and survive, what stopped their citizens from demanding the same? The story of one home invasion was becoming a continental parable. And yet, beneath the smoke and noise, something remarkable happened. Citizens began sending anonymous tips. Bank screenshots, testimonies, whistleblowers multiplied. It was as if the fear had shifted sides. By the end of the week, no one could claim ignorance. The government couldn't hide. The generals couldn't run. And the people could no longer pretend not to see. The aftermath wasn't victory or defeat, it was revelation. Because once betrayal becomes visible, it doesn't vanish with denial. It lingers, it transforms, it demands to be answered. And for Ibrahim Traoré, the cost of that answer was still coming due. If the country were a chessboard, the next week unfolded like endgame. No one moved without consequence. For Ibrahim Traoré, 3 futures hovered before him, each real, each dangerous. The base scenario, the one most analysts expected, was a slow burn. The government would stabilize through controlled leaks. A few mid-level officials would be sacrificed as scapegoats. The scandal would fade beneath newer headlines, and the machinery of power would grind forward, dented, but alive. It was the most likely path, and the most poisonous. Stability purchased with silence. The optimistic scenario felt almost fragile. In this version, Ibrahim's exposure of the fraud would spark a genuine purge. Reformers inside the army and civil service would rally. Stolen pensions would be restored, trust cautiously rebuilt. Foreign investors, long skeptical of Burkina Faso's integrity, might even return. There was precedent. Nations had risen from darker nights. But it would demand discipline, unity, and a kind of forgiveness that politics rarely allows. And then there was the worst case, a counter-coup masked as national correction. Powerful officers, humiliated by the scandal, could frame Traoré as the destabilizer, the man who broke rank. Chaos in the streets would justify their return. It wouldn't matter who lit the fire, only who survived it. The people who once cheered his courage could turn away. Exhausted by fear and hunger, he knew all 3 roads. He also knew none of them were safe. So he chose a 4th, transparency by force. Every document, every account, every name would be made public. He didn't need approval, he needed proof. That decision, made in a quiet office before dawn, redrew the board entirely. It wasn't strategy, it was a reckoning. The question, he murmured to sow, isn't which future is coming, it's whether we'll have the courage to stay awake when it arrives. In that line lay the paradox of his rule, a man trying to rebuild a nation by breaking its rules first. The dust of scandal hadn't settled when the question reached every home. What does this mean for us? It wasn't asked by politicians, but by market vendors, teachers, and soldiers who suddenly realized the war outside wasn't their only battle. Ibrahim Traoré had dragged corruption out of conference rooms and into living rooms. Now, the mirror faced everyone. For those who already cared, the moment was vindication. They had followed every headline, every speech, and finally saw truth made visible. But vigilance came with fatigue. Ibrahim's supporters learned the hardest lesson of civic duty. The change is not a moment, it's maintenance. Their task now was to watch without worship. For those caught in the crossfire, the impact was personal. Civil servants feared purges, traders saw credit lines vanish, parents wondered if the next paycheck would come. They didn't want heroes, they wanted stability. Yet even in frustration, many admitted that injustice exposed was better than peace built on theft. And for those who didn't care until now, the silence became impossible. Ignoring politics no longer meant safety, it meant surrender. Even the most detached citizens began whispering Ibrahim Traoré's name, not with devotion, but with very respect. He had made awareness unavoidable. In cafes, on buses, in schools, the phrase returned again and again. At least someone fought back. That single thought turned spectators into witnesses, and witnesses, once awake, rarely go back to sleep, because in Burkina Faso, ignorance had long been the safest currency. Now, it was worthless. Justice, Ibrahim Traoré once said, cannot survive on slogans. It needs architecture. That conviction became the blueprint for what came next, a roadmap, not of promises, but of work. At the leadership level, he began by dissolving several opaque committees and replacing them with transparent audit cells run by mixed teams of soldiers, economists, and civic representatives. Their mandate: trace every pension, every defense contract, every offshore transfer within 6 months. Progress would be measured not in speeches, but in recovered funds. At the institutional level, new protocols were drafted for financial approvals. No document could move forward without dual verification. One civilian, one military. It slowed bureaucracy, yes, but it also cut the veins through which corruption once flowed freely. The metric was simple. If the system resists scrutiny, it's the wrong system. At the citizen level, the approach was humbler. Mobile banking literacy programs began across provinces. Local councils were given direct communication channels to report suspicious investments. Even schools added a new civics module titled The Cost of Silence. For Ibrahim Traoré, reform wasn't theory. It was repetition until ethics became habit. Finally, he reached outward. Regional cooperation with neighboring Sahel states was revived, not as political theater, but as a shared firewall against cross-border fraud and mercenary financing. The plan wasn't elegant, it was stubborn. And that was the point, because solutions, like revolutions, only endure when they leave fingerprints on daily life. And in the corridors of power, where deceit once felt safe, people now whispered before signing anything at all. Morning returned to the same garden where it had all begun. The wrecked cars were gone. The air smelled of dust and wet soil. Auntie Miriam sat on her bench again, sunlight on her apron, as if the chaos had only been a bad dream. Ibrahim Traoré walked toward her, slower this time, the weight of victory quieter than the night it demanded. He handed her a sealed envelope. Inside, her savings restored. Every coin, plus interest. No speeches, no ceremony, just the correction of a wound that should never have existed. She looked up, eyes wet, and touched the bruise on his cheek. "You fought for this," she whispered. "I fought for us," he replied. For a long moment, neither spoke. The radio nearby murmured news of arrests, reforms, resignations. But here, in this small garden, the war ended differently, with forgiveness that sounded like breathing again, and for the first time, Ibrahim Traoré allowed himself to rest, not as a leader or soldier, but as a man who had kept his word. Because some victories are not won in battlefields, they are won in silence, when someone's dignity returns home. Every story leaves behind a question, and this one belongs to all who have listened. The battle inside Ibrahim Traoré's home may be over, but its echo still moves through every street, every market, every quiet dinner where truth feels fragile. Each listener carries a piece of that night, a reminder that courage isn't loud, it's consistent. If you believe others deserve to understand what really happened, share the story, not for applause, but for clarity. Let it reach those who still think justice is someone else's job, or that dignity can be postponed. And if this story made you pause, even for a moment, ask yourself, what would you have done if you were in his place, when the letter fell open? When the truth hurt someone you loved? Because stories like this are not endings. They are invitations to think, to act, to keep the conversation alive.